Mexico border 1968. In a remote training compound where the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, three different philosophies of combat were about to collide in the most unexpected way possible. One believed in ancient discipline and lightning-fast precision. Another trusted crushing power and methodical technique. The third was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't what you can do with your body, it's what you can do with 2 tons of American steel. The compound sat like a fortress in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but sand, rocks, and the kind of brutal heat that tested human endurance just by existing in it. Established by a consortium of serious martial artists who wanted to train without the distractions and limitations of urban environments, this was where fighters came to push themselves beyond normal human limits, where ancient techniques were tested against modern innovations, and where the conversation inevitably turned to who was truly the most dangerous man alive. The facility included everything necessary for comprehensive combat training. Heavy bags made from materials that could withstand superhuman punishment, wooden posts for conditioning hands and feet until they became weapons capable of breaking concrete, meditation areas where fighters could achieve the mental clarity necessary for life-and-death combat, and an atmosphere of serious dedication to the perfection of human violence that attracted only the most committed practitioners. Bruce Lee moved through his forms with the fluid perfection that had made him a legend throughout the martial arts world, every technique executed with mathematical precision and blinding speed that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human reflexes. At 28, he was revolutionizing martial arts through a philosophy that combined Eastern tradition with Western innovation, creating something entirely new and absolutely lethal called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. His approach to combat was scientific, analytical, and ruthlessly effective. Lee studied every fighting system he encountered, extracted what worked, discarded what didn't, and synthesized the results into a personalized combat methodology that emphasized adaptability, efficiency, and the ability to end fights before opponents understood what was happening to them. Chuck Norris practiced his kicks with the methodical power that had made him a world karate champion multiple times over. Each strike delivered with enough focused force to break concrete blocks and human bones with equal ease. At 28, he represented the pinnacle of traditional American martial arts, disciplined, powerful, and utterly without mercy for opponents who underestimated his capabilities or commitment to excellence. Norris had earned his reputation through tournament competition, where rules existed and referees could stop fights before permanent damage occurred. But his training went far beyond sport, fighting into realms where the only rule was survival, and the only acceptable outcome was the complete destruction of anyone foolish enough to threaten him or those under his protection. James Coburn watched both men with the appreciation of someone who'd studied fighting systems around the world and understood what made each approach unique and dangerous. At 40, Coburn was more observer than participant in today's session, but his presence added intellectual weight to whatever conclusions would be drawn from the training, and his experience in multiple martial arts disciplines provided valuable perspective on what they were witnessing. Steve McQueen stood in the center of the compound like someone who'd been invited to a party where he didn't speak the language, watching techniques that seemed almost supernatural in their speed and precision. At 38, McQueen was there to learn, but his definition of practical combat had been formed in reform schools and street fights, where there were no rules except survival. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy. The training had started respectfully enough, with Lee and Norris demonstrating basic principles of their respective fighting systems, while McQueen attempted to absorb techniques that required years of dedicated practice to master properly. But as the afternoon progressed and the desert heat climbed past 110 degrees, the session evolved from instruction into something more competitive and dangerous. "Your problem, Steve," Norris said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been defeated in sanctioned competition, "is that you fight like a street brawler. All instinct, no discipline. That might work against untrained opponents, but against someone who really knows what they're doing, technique always beats raw aggression." Lee nodded in agreement, his movements never stopping even as he spoke. "Chuck is right. Fighting is like water. It must flow according to natural laws. Your approach is like trying to force water uphill. It requires too much energy and produces inferior results. McQueen absorbed these criticisms without comment, but something in his pale blue eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by their logic. "Show me," he said simply. What followed was less training and more demonstration of superiority, as both martial arts masters began pushing McQueen harder, testing his reflexes, challenging his techniques, and gradually making it clear that his street-learned fighting skills were inadequate against properly trained opponents. Norris landed a series of controlled kicks that would have been devastating at full power, each one perfectly placed and executed with textbook precision. Lee's hands moved so fast they seemed to blur, stopping inches from McQueen's face and throat with timing that proved he could have ended the fight at any moment. "You see?" Norris said after dropping McQueen with a carefully controlled leg sweep that sent him sprawling in the desert sand. "Speed without technique is just flailing. Power without discipline is just wild swinging. A real fighter needs years of training to develop the skills that actually matter in combat." McQueen got to his feet and brushed dust off his jeans, his expression unchanged but something dangerous building behind those pale blue eyes. "Try again," he said. This time, Norris and Lee stopped holding back quite so much. The techniques came faster, harder, with less concern for McQueen's ability to defend himself properly. What had been instructional became punitive, as both men began demonstrating just how outclassed McQueen was when facing opponents who dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of human combat. A spinning kick from Norris caught McQueen in the ribs, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into the sand with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Lee's hands found pressure points that temporarily numbed McQueen's arms, leaving him unable to defend himself against the next wave of attacks. "This is what real fighting looks like, Steve," Norris said, standing over McQueen as he struggled to get back to his feet. "Not Hollywood stunts, not barroom brawling. This is what happens when technique meets raw talent." Lee added his own assessment with characteristic philosophical insight. "The warrior who knows his limitations can transcend them. The warrior who refuses to acknowledge his limitations will be destroyed by them." Both men stepped back, apparently satisfied that they'd made their point about the supremacy of disciplined martial arts over street fighting instincts. McQueen lay in the sand for a moment, testing his ribs and waiting for sensation to return to his temporarily paralyzed arms. When he finally got to his feet, he said nothing to either of his instructors. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the modified Ford Mustang that sat parked 100 yards away at the edge of the training compound. "Where are you going, Steve?" Coburn called out, apparently thinking McQueen had decided to leave rather than continue absorbing punishment from two of the world's most dangerous fighters. McQueen didn't answer. He simply continued walking with that purposeful stride that suggested he'd reached a decision about something important. He reached the Mustang and climbed behind the wheel with movements that seemed deliberate and final. The engine started with a roar that echoed across the desert landscape like the growl of some mechanical predator awakening from sleep. For a moment, Lee, Norris, and Coburn assumed McQueen was simply leaving, driving away from a training session that had become more humiliating than educational, admitting defeat and retreating to lick his wounds in private. Then McQueen put the Mustang in gear and began driving directly toward them at steadily increasing speed. At first it seemed like he was simply heading for the road that would take him back to civilization and away from further embarrassment. But as the car's velocity increased and its trajectory remained unchanged, all three men realized that Steve McQueen wasn't leaving. He was attacking. The Mustang's speedometer climbed past 60, then 80, then 100 miles per hour as it bore down on the three men with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. The modified engine howled with mechanical fury, and dust erupted behind the racing car like the wake of a speedboat cutting through water. Lee and Norris scattered in opposite directions, their legendary reflexes and athletic abilities saving them from being crushed under 2 tons of Detroit steel, traveling at speeds that would have turned them into statistical abstractions. At the last possible second, McQueen yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and brought the Mustang to a sliding stop that covered all three men in a cloud of desert dust so thick they couldn't see their own hands. The engine shut off, and in the sudden silence that followed, they could hear nothing but the ticking of hot metal cooling and their own heartbeats thundering in their ears. McQueen climbed out of the driver's seat with the same casual confidence he'd shown all afternoon, apparently unbothered by having just used a high-performance automobile as a weapon of terror against three of the most dangerous men in America. "You want to know about real fighting?" McQueen said, his voice carrying clearly through the settling dust cloud. "Real fighting isn't about technique or discipline or years of training in some monastery." He gestured toward the Mustang with proprietary pride. "Real fighting is about using whatever weapons are available to destroy your enemies before they can destroy you. You boys can punch through boards and break concrete blocks with your bare hands. That's very impressive." Lee and Norris were still catching their breath from their near-death experience, but they listened with the attention of students who'd just learned something important about combat that no martial arts manual had ever taught them. "But this machine can punch through steel barriers and concrete walls. It can outrun anything on two legs, crush anything that can't get out of its way, and keep fighting long after human endurance fails." McQueen walked around the Mustang, running his hand along the hood like a general inspecting his favorite weapon. "Bruce, your hands move faster than most people can see, but this engine can accelerate faster than human reflexes can react. Chuck, your kicks can break a man's ribs, but this bumper can break a man's everything." He looked directly at both martial artists with those pale blue eyes that seemed to reflect nothing but absolute conviction. "You've spent years learning to fight with your bodies. I've spent years learning to fight with machines. And when the stakes are real, when survival is actually on the line, I'll take 2 tons of American horsepower over the fastest hands or strongest legs any day." Lee was the first to respond, and to everyone's surprise, he began to laugh, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation for what McQueen had just demonstrated. "You know something, Steve? You're completely insane. But you're also absolutely right." He walked over to the Mustang and examined it with the same analytical attention he'd brought to studying martial arts techniques. "We've been thinking about this all wrong. We've been trying to teach you to fight like us, when you already know how to fight like you. And your way might be more effective than ours." Norris added his own grudging respect, though it clearly cost him something to admit that his years of training might be inferior to McQueen's mechanical approach to combat. "I've never seen anyone use a car as a weapon like that. The precision, the timing, the absolute commitment to running us down that took more balls than anything I've ever done in a tournament." Coburn, who'd remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally offered his perspective as someone who'd observed the whole escalation from traditional training to automotive warfare. "What just happened here proves something that most fighters never understand. The deadliest weapon isn't the one you've trained with the longest or mastered the most completely. It's the one your opponent isn't expecting and doesn't know how to counter." McQueen climbed back into the Mustang and started the engine, letting it idle with mechanical authority that seemed to punctuate everything that had just been said. "Next time you boys want to teach someone about fighting, remember this moment. Remember that there are different kinds of strength, different kinds of speed, and different kinds of power." He put the car in gear and began driving away from the compound, leaving behind a cloud of dust and 3 martial arts experts who would never again assume that traditional fighting techniques represented the ultimate expression of human combat capability. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who refuses to play by your rules and brings weapons you never learned to defend against. The sound of the Mustang's engine faded into the distance, but the lesson it had taught would influence how all 3 men thought about combat for the rest of their careers. Some fighters perfect their bodies as weapons. Others learn to use the world itself as their arsenal. And the smartest fighters understand that victory goes to whoever brings the most overwhelming force to the battlefield, regardless of whether that force comes from years of training or American automotive engineering. Steve McQueen had just proven which philosophy was more likely to keep you alive when the stakes were real. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.